Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, my fellow tech leaders, and welcome to the latest episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. My name is Adam Oberhausen. I'm the Director of Cloud Architecture with Right Brain Networks, and I'm your host for today. Joining me today, as always, is software and data consultant Tom Kowalski. Say hi, Tom.
Howdy. Hello.
And of course, let's not forget about my main man, business technology consultant Joe Coleman. What's up, Joe?
Yo, Adam, you're too kind. You're too kind. Thanks for that introduction there. Just letting y'all know I'm here to kind of referee things. So if anyone has any questions throughout the recording here, just go ahead and throw it in the discussion, the chat, and I'll make sure that we get around to it and make it front and center. So thanks so much, Adam.
Yeah, and if we get too far in the weeds, Joe, just throw something out there to bring us back to reality. If you feel like it's getting boring or too technical or
You want
something.
me to bring you back to reality in this tie-dye purple and teal hoodie? I don't know if you're talking to the right guy, but all right, I'll do it. I'll stay on top of it.
Yeah. Okay, so today we're going to talk about feature flags. What are they? How are they used? We're going to talk about some best practices, avoiding pitfalls, and then we'll hopefully wrap things up by talking about some really popular platforms out there. And there's even some open source platforms that I researched for the show that look really interesting. So got a lot to cover today, so grab your lunch and buckle up. Tommy, take it away.
Yeah, very excited. Feature flags near and dear to my heart. Big proponent. So today, to help us talk about feature flags, we're bringing back Bilal Hussein. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Bilal.
Hello, hello. I'm Bilal. I'm currently a senior QA engineer at DataSite. Worked with feature flags a fair bit, I'd say, across my last few roles. And I've got kind of a cool sort of out-of-the-box use case for them that I'll talk about, I'm sure, at some point. But yeah, that's me.
Little sneak peek.
And new to the show, we have Ethan Evans. Go ahead.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Ethan. So right now I'm a senior software engineer at a company called Artifact Uprising. So I've been doing full stack development for about 6 years, and most of that time using feature flags. So excited to talk about them.
Great.
All
Thanks
right.
for being on the show, guys. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy days to come chit chat with us. So, Tom, may I start with my history lesson?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, so history of feature flags. They've been in use since the 90s, as they were introduced as a way to control the release of new features in complex, large-scale systems. So at the time, when they first started using these were feature flags were implemented at compile time. So they were still pretty cumbersome. So you basically have to recompile and re-release the software in order to toggle a flag, which is very different than how they're used today. So I think the idea was there, and just thinking about the way I used to develop things, like sometimes you kind of put in you use your own feature flag just with like a database setting or something, right? There's kind of ways to like toggle things in real time. Anyways, the early 2000s came along, and then that introduced the runtime feature flags, which are more common today. So you can basically toggle things at runtime, make it easier to experiment with these new features. And then over the past decade, feature flags are pretty much all over the place, really popular in agile software development and continuous delivery practices. And there's tons of tools and all kinds of things out there that support feature flags that we're going to talk about today. So that's my little history lesson for the group.
That's interesting. What's the definition if you have to recompile to flip the flag? That's I don't know if that.
And that's I don't know
The
if they have to,
database changes is one thing, but you have to recompile to flip the flag. I don't know.
Yeah. So let's just start with a basic definition of feature flags. Can you give it to us, Ethan?
Sure. Yeah. So feature flags is a way to control what the customer sees whenever they're using your product. So usually there's some service or some product that enables you to set a flag. So you'll have like show feature number 1, and you'll have it on or off for a customer. And depending on what treatment of that feature flag they get, they either see it or they don't, or some behavior changes. And that allows you to do some really cool stuff about testing production, releasing features gradually, and doing that kind of thing.
So have you, in your experience, has it only been like front end, just changing what the user sees, or have you done more also back end feature flags and kind of like different logic or different flows of things?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear if anyone's used it on the back end, because personally, for me, it's most of the time is all front end based. In order to do more of the A/B testing, that kind of thing has been my focus.
Okay. How about you, Bilal?
I
Add to that
guess,
or any?
yeah, I guess without repeating anything that Ethan said, he had a great summary, I think. On the QA side of things, I think it's important to recognize that feature flags can be used to mitigate a lot of risk around releases. So if you have, some two different flows, like for example, an old flow and a new flow, and you're swapping between either, you could very easily, using feature flags, swap between those flows. And if you determine that your new flow is broken for some reason, or you're seeing some unexpected behavior, it's pretty trivial to just swap that back to off and address your issue. Or you could even target a subset of users to try to duplicate that the behavior that you were seeing. So really great tool for mitigating risk around new releases or feature changes.
Yeah, you guys are touching on the benefits of using feature flags, which is something I want to talk about. Ethan, you mentioned just gradual release of new features. That's a key one there. And then you've got the mitigation of risk. You can easily roll back something, or reduce the blast radius of doing something in production, right? So anyone else have any other why use feature flags? What's the benefits?
So kind of the one other thing I wanted to mention is I mentioned kind of an sort of outside of the box approach to using feature flags. Is we recently integrated feature flag checks into our end-to-end tests. So oftentimes you might merge some automation code that accounts for a new flow, and obviously that could break your old test. So what we did is we implemented a feature flag check that allows us to essentially decouple changing tests from having to push or merge any code. So ultimately what that allows us to do is, if we know that there's a feature flag that's controlling whether this feature is on or off, we have end-to-end tests around it. We can use those same feature flags, or a different feature flag for that matter, to control which end-to-end tests are running or which behavior they expect. So not just for front end or back end code.
Fancy. One of the things I researched for the show, which I want to get the thoughts of the panel on, is just feature flags allow increased agility and speed of delivery. Do we agree, disagree with that? Ethan?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
For
definitely
sure. I
agree.
mean, I'm doing that like today and this week. We're working on a PDP redesign. So that's the product detail page. So it's on an e-commerce site. People can configure and learn about products. Hopefully click that add to cart button. So we're working on making changes to that page. And that is something that is pretty critical to the site. So you don't want to mess it up or release anything that's half baked. But one thing with feature flags is that you can kind of deploy stuff that's half baked, get those tickets cleared off the sprint board early, but have them behind a feature flag. So you'll often hear us talk about things in demo to the company about this is in production, but it's behind a feature flag. So that allows us to get a very consistent flow of tickets out the door, even though we're not releasing any new features to customers quite yet, because it's behind the feature flag.
That's a great point. I think historically, if you talk about testing and production, you might trigger some QA folks. But at the end of the day, if you can use feature flags to release this thing to production and ensure that no users are touching it, and then you can start your testing, ensure that sometimes your pre-production environments may not be kind of fully in parity with your production environment, and so having the ability to really limit that blast radius, as Ethan mentioned, is super crucial to mitigating risk around those releases.
Yeah, I know you're a big fan of just like releasing fast and frequently, Tom. So it's just like the feature flag allows you just to start, because you don't want to develop a feature for weeks and months, right? And then go to push it through your automation pipeline, and there's all kinds of problems or integration challenges, right? So if you're deploying, like your first sprint should be like, get the feature flag out there and put some dummy code behind it and get it out there just to kind of get that process of we're releasing it all the time. Is it available to the end user? Maybe or maybe not, right? Depending on what the flag's set to.
Yeah, I feel like you have to, right? If you want to develop fast, right? In this day and age, feature flags are required in some capacity. So, yeah, I'm
Okay.
intrigued as to, are we still going with benefits? More benefits?
Sure. Yeah. We'll transition. We'll finish up benefits, and we'll maybe talk about some best practices.
Yeah.
So the other benefit I had researched was, when we've already talked about it, is improved collaboration between developers, product management, and QA.
Well, that's my question, right?
Yeah.
Who is controlling these feature flags? That's what I've always had issues with and challenges. I'd love to hear the perspective of Ethan and Bilal. Like, who is managing them? Is it
Yeah, from my
product?
experience, I may be having a little bit of internet issues here, so let me know if I'm going in and out. But
Crystal
from my
clear.
experience, a lot of the product managers like controlling the flag so that they can enable and disable features based on when they're running the tests, right? So it kind of enables the product managers to control when a test is running. And when I say test, I'm talking A/B test, which is something we haven't really touched on quite yet, talking about it. But this allows the product manager to give one segment of customers a treatment on the site, and the other segment gets to stay as the control, and then you can learn whether a feature is actually productive or not. So the product manager likes that control in order to be able to run that test, from my experience.
Now, how far can you go with that, right? Because then you have the issues of it's not consistent. Is it kind of like one-time flows that you have a user go through, or do you also use it in the app where they're constantly working on it, and now all of a sudden there's a change to the UI, right? Like, how do you introduce that and like the flipping of it and manage that? When do you use them?
Was that a follow-up for Ethan there, Tom?
Yeah, Ethan or Bilal.
Yeah, I'm missing your question just from my internet issues. Just maybe someone can take that for me.
Yes.
Sorry, could you repeat the question for me? I was half listening. I'll admit.
Yeah, no worries. So if you are making changes to the flow for the user,
Sure.
and experimenting on that, doing it different ways, how do you control what they see, right? Is it, kind of off-putting if it's a different flow and then the next time they use it, now it's different again, right? Like, where do you draw the line in changing that for like the different customers, or how do you display that to them, or make it transparent that you're part of a test, or do you? Like, what situations?
I would
do you
say
use that?
for my current organization, we don't actually do very much A/B testing. I would say for us, it's more of an all or nothing approach. But I think historically speaking, I've seen kind of little banners that will display, "Hey, you're testing, a new flow. You can," and they always give you the option to swap back to the old flow, so you can kind of opt out. I think it's kind of a mixed bag ultimately. Is really, if you're doing A/B testing, sometimes you don't want the user to know, and you want to collect data. A product may want to collect some data to see, how that feature is being utilized differently between, the existing flow and this quote unquote new flow.
See, and then so the question back to you: who controls the feature flags?
Let's say for us,
how does that work?
it's pretty much kind of the anybody can do anything kind of approach. Is ultimately, I would say, product managers can manage that feature flag, but oftentimes for us, it's really either dev or QA. And I would say it's probably a 50-50 share between that. It's really, I think, for my organization, oftentimes QA is doing the actual releasing of this new feature, and then dev might be monitoring and kind of assisting with that. But it could be dev flipping the flag, it could be QA. Generally, product isn't as involved unless there's some sort of testing involved, which at this point we're not doing a lot of, I would say.
Heard of a use case where to follow up on your line of questions there, Tom, where it's like you might have a different flow based on where a customer is located geographically, right? Or like, so, maybe if they're in Europe, maybe the checkout flow is different versus what it is in the US. So I think there's some I feel like that kind of ties into kind of some of the things you were getting at, but
it's kind of another question, right?
Yeah,
where do you draw the line of that feature flag and be able to tag it versus like an actual feature of the software, right? And that logic and functionality. Is there a life cycle for that, right? And then I guess that gets kind of into the feature flag life cycle management, right? Like how do you go from this is a feature flag to now it's part of the software?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great transition to like let's try to talk about some of the best practices with feature flags.
Yeah.
We'll kick it off here. So we've got number one, start with a clear plan, right? So before you implement feature flags, you want to start with a clear plan. Outlines the specific use case, the type of flag to be used, and steps required to manage the flag. Any comments there, Bilal or Tom? Start with
I'd
the
like to
plan.
know, Bilal, how do you manage?
sure.
Are they in the backlog, right? Are they part of tasks of the sprint?
I mean, I feel like they should be, but oftentimes I would say my company is kind of in a transitionary process. Well, we're sort of on the tail end of that, but we used to have our own home-baked solution for feature flags that ultimately relied on passing something in like a query string or a header, that kind of thing, which I think that's more of sort of an explicit, like, you have to have something either in your header or your URL to enable that. Whereas now we're kind of utilizing I think the ubiquitous, Launch Darkly solution where, you have this feature flag in a UI that you're either controlling, in an all or nothing kind of manner where you're targeting a certain subset of users. But ultimately, there is some cleanup that needs to be done, because at the end of the day, if that feature ends up being released and you have your 100% of your users utilizing it, at some point, that feature flag doesn't really matter anymore. And if you're not diligent about cleaning up, those feature flags that are left behind, it can pretty quickly get out of control. So let's say something that we've adopted more recently is having basically some sort of review process that says, hey, this is still in use. Launch Darkly does make that really easy in some ways, because they do give you some metrics on when that feature flag was last checked. So you can really, ultimately rip it out of where you think it lives in code, and then kind of compare, is it still actually being hit? Can we really deprecate this? So for us, it's kind of a slower transition of enabling the feature flag, doing your testing, releasing the feature, and then after the fact, we'll archive and then eventually delete the feature flag based on the data that we've gathered.
You touched on something that, best practice number one, start with a clear plan. And I think a part of a plan for doing feature flags is you want to avoid increasing your technical debt. And you touched on a lot of those things there, Bilal. In order to avoid that technical debt, you need to, make sure that you're using the feature flags consistently. Make sure there is a process for reviewing them, like you talked about, Bilal. I think that's all really good stuff. And because I think you could very easily go down a path of feature flags, and that leads into best practice number two, which is use feature flags judiciously, right? You don't want to over flag your application with a bunch of craziness. So I think you need to be strategic about when to use flags and when to not. So can you talk about when to use them versus not, Bilal? Do you guys kind of have that debate of does this really need to be behind a flag, or do you tend to just like, well, let's put it behind a flag and then just follow our process to deprecate it once it's out there?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to a discussion with the team. At the end of the day, there is a discussion of, hey, is a feature flag appropriate for this? Sometimes the answer is no. In the case of, I think we asked about APIs earlier. I think oftentimes rather than using feature flags, we use versioning for APIs. So whether it's a header or just a new endpoint entirely, oftentimes for APIs, we typically don't use them. I'd say historically, it's been primarily for front end changes or more recently end to end tests. But yeah, I think I think I've strayed off topic a little bit.
That's all good. Yeah. So, and we've touched on, so best practice number 3, clean up old flags. What does that mean? And I think that was a challenge we had in the past, Tom, when we tried to introduce feature flags, where it's like, oh, the pushback from developers would be like, well, then you're kind of managing 2 versions of the code, right? And it makes your app instantly more complicated because you have 2 versions of, or you're adding complexity to your code base by using feature flags. Do you have any? What's your feedback to that, Tom? And like, how do we get through that?
Yeah, you are. And so that's why I kind of brought up and asking Bilal, right? Do you put it on your sprint, right, as a task? And I feel like it should be tracked, right? Removing the feature flag should be, a task that's in the backlog of everything that you're doing. So it is tracked and, being monitored and
I totally agree with that.
for.
Because there definitely should be a paper trail. Because at the end of the day, I think feature flags are intended to be oftentimes short-lived. Of like, hey, we're doing this testing, we're going to release this feature. I would say initially when we started adopting Launch Darkly, there definitely wasn't that culture of ensuring that things were continuing to, like if you're cleaning up the code and that feature flag is no longer relevant, you should be going into Launch Darkly and deleting or archiving that flag. So it's definitely like we're I think at the point where that is something we think about if we know we're if we have a ticket that says, hey, create this branching logic based on a feature flag, there's an accompanying ticket that says clean it up at a later time, and that usually is sort of separate from that main story, but I think it really depends on where you're at in sort of your feature flag journey. Like I said earlier in the process, we definitely weren't doing that, and that ended up, we kind of got to a point where we had a bunch of feature flags that nobody really had any idea if they were still in use, and so we kind of had to have a coordinated cleanup effort and really consolidated a lot of things into sort of a main project. So we're kind of at that point in our journey now where we do create tickets as sort of a reminder to come back to clean that thing up, but we didn't initially.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? Like it's a cultural change, right, in how you're developing, and yeah, it depends on where you are. I feel like you can read up on the best practices of feature flags and everything, but I feel like anybody that's implementing them in their organization is going to go through the same growing pains, right? It's kind of like you got to learn the hard way, and then it's like, okay, we need to manage these better.
You got to do your laundry.
Yeah.
And so that's, you guys pretty much just covered best practice number 4, which is set expiration dates, right? So it's, you have to clean up the old flags, but part of that process is setting an expiration date. So when you define a flag, there should be a date in mind to say, this is the date when this flag gets retired. Best practice number 5, we've got test and monitor performance. So once you get your flag out there and you're actually pushing traffic to the new feature or environment, is that something you guys closely look at? I think Ethan's back, just kind of and Bilal, if you want to take this, go right ahead. But yeah, like, do you guys is there more, how do you monitor how the app does when you toggle the feature? What are you looking for, and how do you do it?
I would say, oh, go ahead, Ethan.
Oh, thanks. Hopefully I'm back now.
Yeah.
We'll see how it goes. Yeah, as far as performance testing and things like that, I think that really heavily relies on the observability piece of whatever you're working on. So if you're working on something on the front end and you're hiding and showing things, it would be really great to be able to get that piece of information about which treatment the user gets and put that into your observability tool, however you do that. I know like Split has an integration for New Relic. That could be helpful, maybe to add that as like a custom parameter on some transactions, or do something like that that's similar in whatever tools you use, so that you can see in a simple chart or a line graph or something that, oh, when they have this treatment, this is their time to interactive on that page, or this is the, whatever other metric that is important to you, how that depends on the split treatment that they receive. So having that hooked up, it's one of those things where if you hook it up once, then it'll pay dividends for however long you're doing A/B testing or split treatments. And so it's a good thing to try to make sure that you utilize early so that you can get the benefits of that as you use them.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, right? The added complexity. Now you're with your observability tools, you're decoupling those deployments and releases of also having like a tracker, right? Like I know I've used New Relic in the past and saying, this is a deployment, and you kind of see like these are the things that changed with this version, but that kind of goes out the window if everything's behind feature flags in those changes. So you should definitely be tying together your observability tools with your feature flags and treatments. Point.
Yeah, I think there's also some at the end of the day, product does usually have a stake in the success of this thing, this feature, whatever it is, and so ultimately the hope is that you have some sort of metrics on how the front end is being used, so you can compare sort of to your baseline and your your new flow. So hopefully you're doing some comparison of the data before and after that flag has been toggled, so you do have some insight into how people are using this thing differently now.
Yeah, it's a good point, because with like an out-of-the-box solution, you can often do more integrations, not just New Relic, but also send it to Segment or Amplitude or whatever other event tracking tool you're using in order to see like how the behavior of the customer actually changes based on whether the feature flag is on or off. And that is the most important bit to know whether what you're changing is providing value to your stakeholders.
Yeah, it's interesting when you hear you guys talk about it, 'cause it's like all these things tie together. And then so like the next best practice, which comes up almost every week, is communicate changes to the team, right? So it seems like feature flag is a real easy way to make a change or do something in an environment, and all of a sudden, if it's not announced or communicated that this change is out there or live, it could cause some friction in an organization. Can you guys talk about the communication aspect of using feature flags, and what's some best, like what are the ways to make sure that you're keeping your developers, product managers, QA, stakeholders all informed when using feature flags?
Yeah, we have kind of a two-prong approach. I'd say the first approach is we do have there's a channel dedicated to announcing changes, and there's an internal tool we use to kind of ensure that all this, basically any management or any stakeholders that need to be aware of these changes are it's sent into Slack, and then there's also some emails that are fired off. And then the second prong is Launch Darkly. At least I'm not sure about Split, but Launch Darkly does offer a Slack integration, so you can essentially have your feature flag changes logged to a Slack channel. So if anybody is wondering if what changes have been made to those feature flags, there's sort of a change log that's always in Slack and ultimately persists forever.
How about your team, Ethan? You guys doing anything? Is very similar approach, or any thoughts on communication piece with feature flags?
I would say that's actually kind of the hardest piece of the puzzle here. So I'm interested to see if Split does have the integration, because that might help us with some of that. Largely, it depends on the person who's doing the change, whether it needs to be communicated out. And I think that often is the product manager who on our team does a really good job at making sure that all the stakeholders understand what changes are happening. And it also is part of the weekly demo of showing things to the company to make sure that everyone understands what's going on with Split or with feature flags, because oftentimes it is more complicated than just like it's out there or it's not out there. Especially if you get to where you're doing some advanced usage. And I think that this is another situation where it's very easy to have multiple feature flags going on at the same time with like hierarchies. So like if this one's on, then check this other flag. If that's on, then the user gets this. And all that should really be avoided as much as possible, and try to keep it as simple as possible and say half the people out there are going to get the new thing, right? And then people can understand that, as opposed to doing something that's very complicated. If your use case allows for that simplicity, then you definitely want to stick to it.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about your support teams, the customer support teams, and if they're not aware of something that's out there, been toggled, or if there's some complex hierarchy, right? They might log into they might screen share with a customer and be looking at a UI they've never even seen because they're not aware of some feature flag that's been toggled, right? So it could get it all comes back to that communication and making sure people understand like why the app's behaving and doing what it's doing.
Yeah, there's definitely a big culture aspect to that. Really, like, at the end of the day, you do have a lot of stakeholders that are generally invested in, the example you shared. If the UI is completely different and support isn't aware of that, I feel like could be an indicator that somewhere along the line you've kind of screwed up a little bit, and really everybody should be apprised of those changes. Really, if some users are going to be seeing that and your support documentation doesn't reflect that, then could be an indication that support hasn't had time to actually update those docs to really match the new reality of your feature. So there's definitely a cultural aspect to ensuring you kind of get the most out of your feature flags.
Yes.
Definitely. So you guys have thrown out Split.
I think, yeah,
Launch
real quick, Tom. I think Ethan had something he wanted to chime in on a best practice, and then we can move on to and then we can move on to the popular platforms.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, thanks, Adam. So one thing I wanted to check in with, just so that everybody is paying attention to it, because it's easy to forget, is that the pricing on these out-of-the-box solutions can often lead to some issues if you aren't careful with them. Because often they are per user pricing, depending on your plan or whatever contract you've set up with these companies. But if it's per user, you have to be careful with having different environments. And a lot of automated testing going on. And depending on how you identify that user to your whatever tool you're using, you could, if you're following QA best practices, and correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but you often want to be creating new accounts for a user depending on whatever product or software you're developing. And in which case, you could accidentally create a new user for every test, and then get charged for that each individual test as a user in whatever tool you're using. So that is something to pay attention to, and just test as soon as you're setting this up, because that is something that you might get a big bill for if you're not very careful.
Yeah.
Great call. Yeah, I've dealt with that with authentication, right? Some of the providers like to charge per unique. So yeah, that does bum me out when you have to change your development flow and how tests are done because of those pricing models. But yeah, it's a good call.
Yeah, oftentimes with this situation, it's kind of gross, but in your code, be like, if QA user, then identify as this ID or some special logic there, or hard code. I don't know. There's different solutions there, but hopefully you don't have to do any major changes just because of the pricing structure of whatever tool you're using.
Yep.
Great call out, Ethan. Tom, I think you were leaning into some of the popular platforms out there. You want to go into that?
Yeah. Because you guys mentioned Split and LaunchDarkly. I'm aware of those. So I've used both of those. Is there anything else that you've used, or any other popular platforms or open source shared ones? I know those are managed ones.
Optimizely is one that's out there. There's another one called ConfigCat, and then there's another one called Flagsmith. These are the ones that I researched for the show. But yeah, I feel like LaunchDarkly and Split.io are kind of the big players. But is there any other ones out there? And those are the managed ones. I do want to touch quickly on the open source ones, but is there any other ones out there that Bilal or Ethan, you guys have used out there in the wild or seen?
I'd be curious to hear if anybody's worked with the AWS option, CloudWatch, evidently. I haven't tried it out or really heard anything about it since it was released, so I don't know if that kind of like sunk or what happened with it. But I do know of that one. Otherwise, yeah, it's mostly been Split and LaunchDarkly for me.
I remember there being a gotcha. I don't know if it was with the pricing or something else that kind of hindered me from leveraging, AWS's offer. But yeah,
So on the open source side of the house, you've got the product called Unleash. There's no shortage of open source ones. These are just ones I randomly looked up before the show. You got Unleash, you got Toggles, Togglz, you got Flipper, and Bullet Train. And it looks like with most of these open source, you'd have to you have to set up the server in your cloud environment, so you're managing. You're able to run the software on in your own cloud. A lot of them have like Kubernetes support. So if you're into the kubes and want to use open source, there's looks like there's some really nice options out there for that too. And it looks like with open source, there's usually like a services team or a sales team that can help you support your implementation. So there's you can kind of hybrid approach it. It looks like with a lot of these open source options as well.
yeah. Would you recommend rolling your own this day and age?
I would not.
Yeah.
But I know there's people out there that are passionate about hosting their own solutions and getting their costs as low as possible, like in your own data center. Sure, if that's what you want to do, but to me, I manage solutions all the way, manage service all the way. Because it just, we want to focus on developing our product and not have to worry about managing some cluster or some other thing, right? We've already got enough to worry about and manage. So
I agree with that. I think at the end of the day, that becomes one more thing that you have to maintain and keep up, or even on the infrastructure side, ultimately that your cloud or CI/CD team or whoever has to really ensure is up and stable, and it just ends up being with especially the open source options available, it just doesn't make much sense, I think, to bake your own anymore.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but do want to open it up if there's any questions or final thoughts before we close it out today. No? Okay. Yeah, it's been a great show. Want to thank Bilal and Ethan for hopping in here today. Ethan, sorry about the internet. Thanks for sticking it out and working through the issues. Much appreciated.
No, thanks. No problem. Thanks for having me.
And as
Yeah,
always, we Tom and I like to hang out after the show and chit chat. So everyone's welcome to stay and hang out. And we'd love to have everyone back next week, where we're going to be talking about Kubernetes, and we're going to have some experts joining the show that really know Kubernetes inside and out. And I'm eager to see Tom debate with these folks on
I'm ready
on whether or not you should even be using Kubernetes in most cases. So thanks again. We'll see you next week, and have a great one. What do I always say, Tom? Lunch is over.
Get back to work.
There we go.